Welcome back to the Digital Accessibility Podcast. If you're looking to learn more about the field of accessibility, how to implement it within your role or your company, or to get advice on where to start or see how others have navigated complex issues that you may find along the way, then you're in the right place. I'm honoured to be able to share these insightful chats with thought leaders, advocates and practitioners of digital accessibility throughout this podcast, and I hope you'll find it a useful resource. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the chat. Today's guest is someone whose name will be familiar to many in the accessibility community. I'm joined by David Sloan, Chief Accessibility Officer at Vispero or TPGi, an experienced accessibility, inclusive design and UX researcher, consultant, educator and speaker who's worked on both sides of the Atlantic since moving to the US in 2023. David's work has spanned user research with older and disabled people, evaluating digital products for accessibility and usability, advising on pragmatic remediation, and helping organisations design and implement accessibility strategies. So he brings a wealth of experience in inclusive UX, organisational accessibility maturity, legislation, standards and technical best practice. So we're going to talk about David's journey, the evolving landscape of accessibility consultancy, the rise of automation, sounds like the rise of the robots, job market trends, and what's next for teams like companies like TPGi and Vispero in the year ahead. So welcome to the podcast, David, and apologies for such a long intro, but you've just done so much.
Yeah, 25 plus years. No, thank you, Joe, for having me on. It's great to be here, and it's just great the fact that we have accessibility podcasts and an audience that wants to listen to people talk about accessibility. When I started out, the idea of that happening was I just couldn't imagine it. So it's great to see how far this whole industry and advocacy movement has come.
Yeah, well, the honour is all mine, David, because it's just an absolute pleasure to get to speak to you and to do this as well. I think, like you say, to have the audience and the backing of my employer to do something like this is great. And there's so many out there as well, which is good. So hopefully it's a relevant resource for many. But thank you for contributing.
Oh, my pleasure.
So we'll start at the beginning. Very good place to start, someone once said. So your journey and entry into accessibility. So what originally led you to specialise in accessibility and inclusive UX? And then I guess second part of that question is your journey to becoming Chief Accessibility Officer, which is an amazing title we're starting to see a bit more of.
Yeah, so I guess like a lot of people, I didn't plan to do this job when I certainly was at high school. I went to university in Glasgow to study topographic science. I was fascinated by maps as a kid, so that was all I wanted to do, is like get paid to draw maps. So I did that. I got a job with a big publisher and worked in a team creating atlases of the world. So that at that time, the work was all about transforming sort of very traditional printing, traditional ways of creating maps into a digitized version. So creating a big geographical information system and then outputting sheet maps or pages of an atlas or whatever. So I joined them just as they were in this huge technical transformation. So I kind of ended up doing a lot, having to get more familiar with tech more quickly than I expected. And this was all sort of mid-90s, so pre-Google Maps. And I imagine everything's completely changed now. Anyway, after a few years, I thought, okay, I need to get more skilled up in tech. So I quit that job and went back to university and decided to go to Dundee University, to the School of Computing there, to do a master's. And it turned out when I got there that the School of Computing was just this huge research center in accessibility for older and disabled people. So most of the professors and lecturers and researchers were doing something related to accessibility, which is really unusual. Rather than just one or two people in the corner, most of the school were doing accessibility in some form or the other, whether it was a sort of usability focus or more exploring alternative and augmentative communication for non-speaking people, older adults. There was just so many different topics, and it meant that the way that they taught accessibility was kind of spread throughout all the teaching curricula, whether you were doing a undergrad in computing or a master's as I did. It was just there. And it was not something I'd ever thought about before, but just the way that the staff there talked about accessibility, it just really engaged with me. So instead of doing that class for 1 year and then going back into industry, I ended up staying there for 14 years. Did a PhD, did a bit of teaching. We set up a little internal accessibility consultancy, and this was like back at the beginning of the 2000s. So WCAG 1 had just been published, and I thought everyone knew it and everyone was following it. So we started doing accessibility audits, and the way we'd write them was kind of, I don't know. We had very high expectations that people just knew what they were doing and had just made mistakes. So it took us a while to adjust communication. You don't help people get better by kind of yelling at them or sort of, just sort of assuming that they're incompetent or whatever. So we just had to evolve our communication style to be more sympathetic to the fact that not a lot of people knew about accessibility, even though lots of people at Dundee were talking about it. So learned a lot of lessons, and it was really a great place to build a broad awareness and a big focus on people. One of the Dundee philosophies was that a lot of the research was done with people with disabilities rather than academics in the ivory tower coming up with problems and then kind of foisting solutions on users. There was much more partnership. So we built as part of the campus development, we built this new building, the School of Computing, that had a drop-in center for older adults that would, so people who were retired would come and learn about accessibility or learn about tech in a very kind of friendly environment. And the researchers would talk to them and sort of build up relationships, and then the people would, they could just come and learn how to use PowerPoint or whatever, have a cup of tea with others. And there's the opportunity to take part in research projects or even help with teaching. So it was just a really nice way of partnering with people. So that kind of spirit has always lived in me. And it's kind of poignant that we're talking about this because one of my old bosses, Peter Gregor, died just the other week. It's just, I've been reflecting a lot on Peter's influence on my careers and accessibility professional and the whole kind of Dundee approach to doing things. So it's, they were saying and doing things 25 years ago that are still seen as kind of progressive even today. So I'm very grateful for having had the chance there. So that went for, like I say, 14 years or so. During that time, we started doing some subcontract work for TPGi, as they were called back then. And when I decided on a career change, I called Mike Paciello and Charlie Pike and said, "Hey, I'm thinking of moving into doing sort of going independent consultant." And they said, "Oh, would you consider working for us?" I went, wow, yes, absolutely. So yeah, that was when that kind of chapter turned to a new chapter and started as a consultant. So
amazing. Yeah, and strength to strength. And very sorry, just to touch on that, very sorry to hear about the loss of your former colleague and inspiration, I suppose, as well.
Yeah.
But someone that's going to be living on through the way that you do things, and a lot of people are doing things in the accessibility world. So it's amazing.
Absolutely, and beyond, because a lot of graduates from Dundee's undergrad and postgrad programs would go into other, be software engineers, developers, product managers, but they had that accessibility training throughout everything they did. So they were kind of almost guerrilla accessibility specialists, even though they were. So they often ended up starting up accessibility programs, even though they'd been hired to do different jobs, just because it was something they knew about and they knew needed to be considered right from the start. So yeah, it's quite a legacy.
Amazing. And it is something that's always a struggle point in the recruitment or sourcing of people with those skills, because a lot of times it is a side of desk thing. It's something that people pick up additionally to what they're doing, whether that's in a technical role or more strategic type role, even more so in design or design systems and things as well. So it's one of those where it's probably because of the lack of modules in university in those courses that speak about inclusion and accessibility. I think that's starting to change a bit more, but it's nice to hear that it was already happening so much at Dundee, and a shame that it didn't sort of catch on across the whole of the UK or globally.
Yeah, it's funny. There was a blog post just a couple of weeks ago by somebody from Intopia, Australian digital accessibility consultancy, who are doing some fantastic work. And it's talking about, this is one of their newer hires who'd finished a degree in IT, and they didn't learn about accessibility at all. And it was a chance for me to kind of reflect on the Dundee approach. And we certainly talked about it a lot. We'd present, here's ways to educate people in accessibility, spread it throughout the curriculum, but it does require a lot of teaching staff to know enough about accessibility and how it applies to their topic for that to be successful. You could have a couple of passionate, knowledgeable instructors in accessibility, but if it's only them and their colleagues are, I teach software engineering, I've got nothing to do with accessibility. I don't know about that. I think you do, but it's making that persuasion and having people with other that teach other subjects sort of follow those principles of accessibility when they're presenting examples of things to during teaching, or assignments, or marking. When students submit assignments and it's for a completely different topic, but if they're not getting marked down because they coded in an accessible application for a completely different module, then that becomes a problem, because the accessibility advice taught in one course isn't reinforced elsewhere. So I think that kind of trying to spread that knowledge around has still been a challenge. We've got some passionate specialists, but it's getting that across everyone who teaches, and that's still a challenge.
Hugely. And I think it's one of those where, like you said quite poignantly there as well, that some people might not realize how much they already do know, or how much they're already doing that is helping with inclusive tech or accessibility. But it's that awareness. I guess that's why we have platforms like this as well, to raise that awareness. And yeah, you might not realize some of the small incremental things that you do day to day are helping so many people. So celebrate those wins.
Exactly. Yeah.
Brilliant. Great. Well, something a bit of a step change, I suppose, for the next question. It's something that's in huge conversation recently. I did watch an episode of your own a podcast recently where you're talking about AI, and automation and AI is rife. I think we're seeing an awful lot of it around accessibility testing and auditing as well, in particular. It feels that there's a lot of pop-ups, I think, since the EAA announcement as well. There's a lot of people that are being able to sort of capitalize on that newfound awareness, or raising that awareness, and we can fix this. I don't want to say that there's lots of snake oil out there, because that's not the intention, I hope, but it is, it's the presumption that it can be fixed very easily with an AI or a chatbot or something. So I wanted to know, from your perspective, are we at risk of using tools like that, or automation or AI, prematurely, and by doing so blocking the real progress in accessibility? Because as you've said there, even from the inception of your sort of career and time in this space, it was about the people, the lived experience as well, being around that and creating that confidence from real user interaction, research, and the lived experience.
Yeah, it's a complex topic with a lot of answers, and I could probably speak for half an hour just answering this one question. So I'll try and kind of break down the answer into different topics. I think one thing to start off with is accessibility professionals love automation. When it helps us do our work faster and more effectively, cuts down on errors, it can be something that makes results more consistent across different teams. So automation in general is something that a lot of people really embrace, and that I think of my former coworker Ian Lloydie and his accessibility tools resource. He's always finding ways to write scripts to automate some aspect of the auditing process, even if it's kind of organizing screenshots into a sort of a standard naming convention so that they're easy to find and easy to pull into a report, little things like that. So the idea that some people have kind of put forward is that there's this kind of conflict between accessibility professionals who want to preserve this craft, this manual craft, versus tools that can do things quicker and to scale. I think there's a kind of false conflict that's been created there. We all want to see tools that can automate the process of making accessibility easier and faster and more efficient. It's when tools overpromise or create more work than we had before that there becomes a big problem. And yeah, I think that there is a concern that if automation, whether it's AI-powered testing or chatbots that kind of give you advice on how to code a component appropriately, this idea that and teams won't need to know anything about accessibility to build applications. Is that a good thing? I'm not sure it is. I really don't know that that's a good thing. It feels a kind of ableist view of what the role of technology in society. You don't have to know about the diversity of the humans that you're building for. That's a challenging message. I mean, I get that the scaling, there's so many, especially from a remediation perspective, there's so much content out there that has accessibility issues. But again, we're kind of thinking about what does it mean to be accessible or inaccessible? Can people use stuff, or does it pass a bunch of automated tests? And there's definitely difference there. So even the way that surveys are reported, like the WebAIM survey, they don't say it themselves, but others will say it, that 96% of the web is inaccessible to disabled people. It's kind of taking some data and presenting it in a way that means that we have a bigger problem than maybe we actually have, or the problem looks different to what we have. So the answer of automation then sounds more compelling than it might be. So yeah, I think I definitely see any tool that can make my job faster and more efficient. Bring it on. I'm all for it. And if that's AI powered, then great. We'll put the financial and environmental concerns of AI to one side. That regardless of how you're using AI, those are always going to be issues. But when it comes to addressing accessibility, as long as the tool doesn't perpetuate the biases that already exist that accessibility professionals are in a job to address, then we're good. But if it's kind of perpetuating that, or and it's a real concern here that there's more work for accessibility professionals to test and remediate AI slop, then have we actually moved forward? So that's the big question for me, and for a consultancy like ours. It's interesting to see whether we're going to the nature of our work will change as we're auditing and more content and code that's been generated largely through AI tools. So yeah, I feel like it's a bit of a tsunami, like the wave is coming towards us, and we're sort of bracing ourselves for what it means.
Yeah, definitely. And we had a very brief chat just before the episode about the ARC toolkit, and I guess that there's an element of, I think you mentioned that being a TPGi browser extension, wasn't it? It's like assisted testing or assisted
Yeah.
auditing. So you kind of learn as you're doing, rather than it doing everything for you. It still requires someone to sort of go through and understand what it is, and it gives you sort of that advice. I think that type of automation, where it's also then instilling more knowledge into professionals or into people that are maybe not quite there yet. It's got such potential, isn't it, to increase that, and it's like becoming a moderator rather than an auditor, I suppose. You're moderating what's being spat out and making sure that it's correct and not completely biased.
Yeah, I've always felt that anything that gets you started and gets you a long way down the road is better than something that doesn't help you at all. I mean, I think of automated captioning, and the way that we've got we've certainly come a long way there. And one of the biggest leaps for me is that the process of generating text and having timestamps that synchronize it with when those words were spoken, that's automated. That's great. You don't have to do that manually. There's back in the day where you'd have to type the text and then press generate a timestamp, and it was all manual before in order to create the caption file. Now you don't have to do that. Your job is to edit away mistakes and things, and that's it seems like a lot of people prefer editing something that exists to improve it than creating it from scratch. So the more we can head that direction, the better. And like you say, the guided accessibility testing, an automated tool that leaves you with, here's some things you need to do, as long as it doesn't kind of say all the automated checks are passed, here's some manual checks, and it's kind of, oh, well, I don't need to worry about them because the tool's passed. If the tool can sort of say, you haven't finished the work yet, half of it's done, but the other half, the manual checks, you have to verify that you've done them, then there's a little bit of gamification there. Doesn't anything that doesn't make it seem like the job's done when the automated rules are all passed. You've still got some more work to do.
And I don't know if there's any more sort of, I know that more rudimentary, versions of those types of tools were spitting out quite a lot of false positives on contravening the WCAG success criterion. But I think that's improving as tech is getting better, and that's always good. But like you say, it's the content of what it's spitting out. So it's not just, I mean, I've had it, and my wife was telling me that she had a former colleague that she would write up contracts. She works in HR. She would write up a contract. She'd send it to someone to review, and they'd send it back and say, there's a mistake. It's a 42-page contract, not told her what it is, and she's had to scroll through all of that to re-find that mistake, rather than just hit a backspace where there was one too many, and just say that's fine. It's like it needs to be helpful, doesn't it? It can't just be like, this is black and white, this is right and wrong. It's so much more complex than that. So it's people much more smart than me, probably more on your level, will be able to figure that out.
Yeah, I think that the point of minimizing false positives is important, given that accessibility still has this reputation of being this costly, fixing stuff just before product launch. I mean, we've been trying for years to promote this shift left strategy where we distribute accessibility throughout the product development life cycle, but there's still this reputation that it's an exercise in remediation. It costs money. It slows things down. So false positives just add to that. If you're telling me to fix this thing, but it isn't actually an accessibility issue, that's not good for advocating accessibility internally. So anything that can minimize that, for sure. But at the same time, false negatives are also a problem. If it's not telling you stuff that you should be knowing about, then that's a problem too. Definitely.
Absolutely. I mean, so that, but kind of the automation then brings me on quite nicely to the next part. And obviously it's very relevant to my role in sourcing people and jobs for people, the job market pressures, and hearing a lot about loan accessibility specialists. And I guess a nice thing that we've discovered from your background was that you seem to have had people around you from the start that are passionate about this, that know about this space, and it's probably assisted you in your journey, I hope, that you've had people there. And it's such a giving community, because as much as there's obviously competition between consultancies, between individual teams and companies, within tech you don't see as much sharing as you do in the accessibility space. But still with that, it can be quite lonely. There's the lone accessibility specialist problem, where a global company may have one person and they've got the job of 5 people, and they don't, because there's not the awareness of how much that takes to get things going, both on the design, on the development or implementation of new sort of technologies, then the remediation and testing, the strategy in general, the advocacy, the evangelism, the list goes on, and that's on one job spec most times. So we're also seeing a lot of companies that have built wonderful teams, and then you can't avoid it. It happens to every sort of team, but it feels more personal when people are let go in the accessibility space, probably because I'm so close to it. But what would be your take on that dynamic, and how can organizations move away from that one person accessibility team and build something that's a bit more sustainable in terms, like, because I know that we talk a lot about champions and networks of people within companies, but I don't know how much that's supporting if it is just the one person that's responsible.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I guess when one thing to note is just my privilege of having had the opportunity to work in an accessibility consultancy for 13 years or so now, and working in an accessibility consultancy. The one thing that you know is that the work that you're doing for clients, they've asked you for it, they're paying you to do it. So there is an aspect of, we want you to do this for us, and then when you deliver the work and the client, you may ideally you'll hear from them again, but you might not, but then you'll be moving on to other work. So there's slightly less of a kind of personal stake in whether your work has a positive impact. I mean, obviously we want it to be, but it's a little bit different. So I think that it is one good thing about consultancy, that we get to do that. But at the same time, it's a challenge that you don't have that kind of, you don't see things through. You're kind of moving on to another project. You don't know if the team remediated the audit. Did they really? Was that remediation advice useful, or was that strategic guidance we provided helpful? So, ideal, when we have long-term relationships, we get to know that, but otherwise not. But I think, I've been thinking a lot about the whole challenge of the sort of single accessibility specialist, and it's always been there, where somebody has a lot of responsibility, and it's maybe in part they've taken it on because they've been interested, but they have no authority to make decisions or to get other people to do things. And then it becomes, it's almost like it's up to the individual to figure out what success looks like for them. And one thing that I've learned a lot over my career is, if I can judge my success as being committed to other people's success, if I can help other people be successful, then I've been successful too. So if somebody that I'm trying to persuade to do something, and I'm having difficulty, well, what does success look like to them? How can I help make sure that accessibility efforts support that? Figure out that, and then when they are successful, then I will sort of bask in that. So it's a sort of subtle mindset, figuring out how you lift others, and I know that can be challenging when you feel like you're a single team member and you have very little influence, but just looking at adjusting what success looks like for you, so that you don't have this kind of huge passion that you've got to fix everything and then it doesn't happen, and then you feel like you've failed and you don't know where to go next. So I think it's sort of just looking at what success looks like for you as an accessibility professional. What changes are realistic to make? What baby steps can you encourage your organization to take and celebrate those changes. We all know, and sometimes we're our own worst enemies in terms of we know how far we could go, and it's just like the audit reports that's 150 pages long. Here are all the fixes you need to make, and people are like, I don't know what to do, so I'm just going to put it on the side and carry on with other things. We can be so focused on trying to get as close to perfection or completeness as possible that we stop people making any progress at all. And there's a reason we don't want to have people experience barriers. We want teams to remove all accessibility barriers and make everyone be able to use the product regardless of disability. But yeah, sometimes it's like picking your battles and identifying what your successes are and really celebrating them, and don't beat yourself up if something didn't go as far as you wanted it to.
Yeah, I think it's something that's becoming a bit of an age-old adage, which is the progress over perfection. As long as we're taking some steps forward, then it's progress. And it is. I think that one of the main frustrations that underlies everything for accessibility is that the web was built to create more ease, right? It was meant to be this tool to help everyone have access to things and links and new documents and things like that. So it's like, how has it come this far? But I guess because there's been so much progress in other ways, it's just created those barriers naturally. Or is it because the design is for the people that were creating or designing products and services weren't really thinking about everyone?
Yeah, it's interesting. My wife gave a talk at the WebAIM conference last month, and she looked back at Tim Berners-Lee's early proposal for the web, and he talked about how it was a sort of a way where data could be shared regardless of its format, and that you could write data. So it was a read and write web, his idea, and it was kind of regardless of how you accessed, what kind of computer you used. You could share information, you could write it, and someone else could read it. And he was trying to address a technical problem, which then naturally extended to people. That people have different needs and capabilities. So accessibility was something that was talked about back in the early day, but then, I guess as the web was this huge space of innovation, pretty unregulated compared to the physical world. So people were doing all sorts of things, and this figuring out how to make money from it. So it's great opportunity as this place where you could innovate and do what you wanted. And if your idea other people kind of took on board, then you'd do well. There weren't so many constraints, and so we were building this digital environment that really, compared to the physical environment and building codes and all that kind of stuff, where it's much more tightly controlled as to what you can build, especially if it's a public space, a place where other people can spend time in. That kind of freedom to innovate in the tech world was also something that created a new products, new ways of building things that didn't really think about people other than those that were inventing those new ways of doing things. And
yeah, and that's I guess it's that oversight, I suppose, and it's just something that happens everywhere, doesn't it? But it's nice that there's a dedicated part of the world that is trying to put that right, which is great. And then I guess taking us on to the next sort of topic, which was elevating organizational maturity. And I suppose you were touching on this earlier, and I probably shouldn't have added that extra question, sorry, where you said as an accessibility consultancy, there's almost limited at times, dependent on client relationship and how long that's sort of continuing, but limited ability for them to really utilize you as an external team that's continuing with that support. You know, you're delivering what you've been asked to deliver, and then it's up to them. But is there an element of injecting that organizational maturity from a consultancy side, from the outside in?
Yeah, we're always thinking of ways that we can do that effectively. You know, like a lot of accessibility consultancies, often our first relationship with a customer is they've discovered accessibility. Maybe they got sued, or maybe a customer of theirs are building an application that they want to sell to a third party, and the third party said, "Is it accessible?" No, we don't know. So people come to us and ask for an audit. Tell us how we're doing right now and what we need to fix. And sometimes it's a very sort of pragmatic. We realize that we've probably got a lot of work to do. We just need to know how much. And in other cases, it's test our site and then just verify that it's accessible. And it's a little bit more. Well, I'm not sure it's going to be as accessible as maybe you think it is. So that relationship starts. Tell people where they are just now and what needs to happen to get them to where they want to be, which is kind of the question of organizational accessibility maturity. We start specifically with a product, and then an audit will tell them what's wrong with it. But the audit also generates data that helps you figure out why did that issue crop up. Is that in a component that you reuse in other products that you build? Is that because you engaged a media producer that doesn't give you captions, so you're failing all those SCs around accessible media? So the audit is always an opportunity to start looking at processes and figuring out where did that issue come in, and why, and how could we solve that? So having that conversation can start to help